This time on Burnouts and Rotor Blades, we're going to rebuild this old Holley carburetor.
Welcome to the Burnouts and Rotor Blades YouTube channel. Let's go do something awesome.
This 600 CFM Holley 4160 carburetor is off of my 1972 Chevrolet Vega. It is perfect for feeding the small block 283 that now lives in the engine bay, and the smiles prove it works well. Unfortunately, after a short stint powering my dad's 1955 Chevrolet pickup and some sitting around, it started looking pretty gross and it now needs a cleanup. First, let's clean up our workbench for the rebuild. That's better. Now time to go grab a chair so we can work comfortably. The wife isn't here because the kitchen is empty, and now I'm sure she won't mind this at all. I know this carburetor is a 600 CFM 4160 vacuum secondary because of the way that it is. But if you're wondering what your carburetor is, you can Google the model number found here on the choke horn after list. That should take you to the Holley website's carb list like this one. The list breaks down everything you need to know, including rebuild kit, part numbers, and some of the things that it came with when your carb was right out of the box. Personally, I find using a spreadsheet that has only headings on the very top really annoying, so I laid a second web page over the top of the first one so I can refer to the headings more easily. If we scroll down to my 6619 carb, we can see it's listed as a 600 CFM 4160 that requires a 37-720 repair kit and has a 6.5 power valve. Armed with that information, we'll head to O'Reilly's and use whatever universal Holley kit they have and whatever leftover parts we have from the last rebuild. Let's see if this carb is even worth rebuilding by checking how much play the shafts have in the throttle plate. I can't feel any, which is good. I don't have a number to measure, but if you can make them click and feel significant movement, look at replacing the throttle plate. If there's a lot of play, the engine will run like there's a vacuum leak because excess air will come in through the worn out shaft bores without picking up any fuel along the way. The primary side bowl comes off with a few whacks of this soft face hammer before we flip it over for an initial inspection. We can see that the float, needle, and spring are all intact and move the way that they should, and so does the accelerator pump. We'll remove the crossover tube, and I like to make sure that we remove these easy to forget O-rings so I don't put two in later. This hole's not big enough for two, and you might bend something trying to force it in. With everything looking so good so far, you might wonder why we're tearing into this carb. This O-ring crumbles when it shouldn't, and it's a pretty good representative of all the other gaskets and seals I found in this carb. I like to scrape all the old gaskets off during disassembly. It gives me time to inspect each part during the teardown so I can make a list of anything that needs to be ordered. The float level adjustment screw gaskets are notorious for getting stuck, so I use this little razor blade trick to clean them off. Move slow and watch your fingers if you do use this trick, but I'm sure there's a smarter way to do this. The float, needle, and seat come out next. Some carbs might have different sizes in the front and rear bowls, so note the numbers stamped on the top during removal. This one seems to move pretty well and wasn't leaking. I plan to replace it anyways, but I'll add it to my stash of spare parts just in case. I do recommend replacing the O-ring at a minimum though. Next, the fuel inlet baffle comes out, followed by the float. This float is an older version. Most of the newer floats are plastic and are hinged at the rear instead of the side. Either way, it's good to shake it and make sure you don't hear any liquid inside. If the carb has been dry for a while, you can inspect them by making sure no bubbles come out when you submerge it in liquid. There's no obvious signs of leakage, so on to the accelerator pump. Here we're looking to make sure the sealing surfaces are in good shape and the spring is still springy. Also note the direction of the gasket whenever you remove it. The green gaskets are ethanol friendly, and I would recommend running them whenever rebuilding with today's fuel. I don't have any more, so I'll have to replace this one again in less than a year after the black gasket develops a leak. Newer carbs have a rubber flapper that gets installed here from inside of the bowl for the accelerator pump. This older style has a ball, and I'll spend a few seconds scraping off the dried ethanol before we soak it in carb cleaner. Honestly, it's either now or later. The fuel level check plug has a metal gasket. New ones come with most rebuild kits, but you can reuse it. The same is true for both seals on the inlet fitting and banjo bolt. On the top of the float bowl, we can see the deposits left by the ethanol, and on the bottom is where all the real junk is left. I'd like to take a second to remind you to hit the like and subscribe buttons below. That would really be a huge help to me. If you have any comments or questions about this build or just want to, please leave a comment below. Up next is the primary metering block. These can be a bit tricky as they sometimes seem glued in place. Prying here usually works, sometimes on both sides. Other times you have to soak the carb to get the gaskets to free up. A 1-inch wrench helps loosen up the power valve. However, it shouldn't be in there very tight. If there's fuel on this side of the metering block, it might be an indication that you have a bad power valve. The power valve helps with part throttle drivability, and different engines operate with different size power valves. This 6.5 power valve that came stock in this carb works really well in most stock applications and works well in the Vega. You can see how it moves nicely and doesn't have any gunk, so it'll go right back in during the buildup. The metering block is where all the magic happens. There are a ton of tiny little passages that can clog with gunk. The main jets are no different. The main jets are responsible for fuel flow into the metering parts of the carburetor. After checking that they are clear of debris, make sure that the jets are stamped with the same size and that both the holes look about the same size. There are some situations where different jets are used, but this is typically not the case. The idle adjustment screws are the first metering adjustment. The tips are supposed to be sharp and there is a cork gasket above the threads. You'll follow these same steps if you have 2 or 4 corner idle adjustment. Much like the rest of the carb, there is fuel residue everywhere, but thankfully no real sludge buildup. The secondary float bowl comes off in the same manner as the primary. Be sure none of these plastic washers that seal the float bowl are left in. Sometimes they're easy to miss. Disassembly is the same as the primary bowl with the exception of the accelerator pump. A 4150, commonly called a double pumper, will have an accelerator pump and a metering block on the secondary side. This simpler carb has a metering plate. The specialty tool that fits in these screws will come with a rebuild kit, but a small flathead screwdriver will work if they aren't over torqued. The metering plates can be switched out if your application wants something different. They can be identified by the number stamped here, and this is a 39. However, Holley makes a kit to add a secondary metering block for this carb. I've done this upgrade on a previous video linked above. The automatic choke assembly and the secondary vacuum pod are next for removal, and I find that it's easiest to remove them with the carb upside down. Both items have 3 screws, a cork gasket, and a single linkage held in place with a circlip or cotter key. After all 3 screws are out of the choke, the cotter key will be easiest to reach with a pick or needle nose pliers. That was a really lucky shot to have the cotter key jump onto my glove like that. After the choke is removed, I'll discard the cork gasket and break the choke down. Before disassembly though, note the position of the ground wire and the adjustment marks. The rebuild kit comes with a new gasket, but it does not come with a new fast idle cam assembly. We'll clean this one up and reuse it because it's free. The vacuum pod also comes right off with 3 screws and a C-clip as promised. We won't break this vacuum pod down because I've replaced the diaphragm recently. However, a quick check of your health of your vacuum diaphragm is to move the arm in and out to see if you get air from the little hole where the gasket is. The accelerator pump squirter is how the accelerator pump gets fuel into the engine. It has sized orifices or nozzles like this fancy version and a check valve that sits below the hold down screw. I tried to remove the check valve with various tools for the video, but in the end I ended up dumping it into my hand. It was just too much of a pain in the butt. The prevailing wisdom with the accelerator pump squirter nozzle sizing is the lighter the car, the bigger the nozzle, since the engine can climb in RPM faster with less mass to move. So if your car stumbles under load when you whack the throttle, an improperly sized accelerator pump could be the culprit. The throttle plate is the last bit to come off of the carb. I see this as a very necessary step simply because it is hard to clean the idle transfer slots with this installed. I'll show you what I'm talking about in a second. The carb main body has fuel residue in every one of its holes, and the throttle bores are caked with junk. Also, the throttle body is looking pretty rough with considerable corrosion on all of the throttle blades. These are the transfer slots, and the holes next to them feed the engine at idle. It is incredibly important that these are clean or the engine just will not idle well. The surfaces and slots down here should look sharp and machined. I found casting slag left behind before in these slots and filed it away, and the carb worked much better afterwards. I do not see any reason to remove the choke plate. The screws are tightened and staked to spread the material out and prevent them from coming loose over time. A quick inspection shows that while the carb body has a lot of fuel residue left behind, there's no pitting or other damage to the surfaces. The boosters look good from the underside, and the bores look to be in generally good condition. It isn't necessary or desirable to have smooth bores because a little air turbulence is important for a good air-fuel mixture. So nothing so far has stood out as bad on this carb, and it's disassembled as far as is necessary for cleaning, and all the old seals and gaskets have been scraped off. My weapon of choice for cleaning parts is this can of Berryman's Chem Dip that I've had, no joke, for probably 5 years. It's seen some serious use and it still does a great job. The basket is a great idea, but it just doesn't allow the whole carb body to get submerged inside the can the same way all the small parts can be. For bigger and nastier parts, I like to use this nylon bristled rifle cleaning brush. Anything more aggressive and it can remove metal, which can affect how the carb operates. There's no secret to it, just follow the instructions and apply copious amounts of elbow grease. The chemical in that red canister is brake clean. It helps lubricate the scrubbing action, and there's a little satisfaction from watching all the grime wash off the parts. Also, the time just starts to fly by cleaning with this stuff. The solution I found for getting the bigger parts in the Chem Dip is to borrow some Tupperware from the wife and dunk tank the carb body and throttle body into it. I'll rotate the carb body out and the bowls will get in also. This part is just here for me. There's something very satisfying about watching the grime melt away. Shh, just watch. Oh yeah. I loosely follow the instructions off the back of the can, and after the Berryman does its magic, the rifle brush is next. To finish it off, I blow out every hole I can get my nozzle up to with a blast from the compressor. This is also a neat way to understand where all of these holes go, and by extension the path each circuit takes through the carb. For example, this is the idle circuit, and you can see where it goes through the carb and have a little fun with it. It's kind of a learning experience, and I highly recommend that. Alright, you're just playing with it now. I didn't agitate the Chem Dip or anything, and this is what fell off in the wife's bowl. I'll toss that in the sink so she can clean up after herself. And the parts are looking much better now, and I'll take a second to just let my OCD enjoy this moment. We'll start by assembling the bowls. These seat assemblies come in various sizes. It's hard to see, but the number is right by the threads. In my E85 carb video, for example, a much bigger seat was used for the higher fuel flow demand. For the Vega, this 97 will be just fine. A couple of things to remember when assembling the carb: nothing needs to be much more than finger tight or you're just smashing seals. If you have to force it, then something is probably wrong. And everything went together pretty easily and everything went together pretty easily and without any issues at all. There were no issues putting this carb together. Not even this. Okay. Alright. Everything went together pretty. Get in your home. During this stage of the assembly, we're setting up the carb to a baseline tune. For example, the floats are set to level, which we can dial in later based on what the engine wants. So be deliberate on how you assemble and set things up to save yourself a lot of potential headaches later. Both bowls are pretty much the same, except for on this carb, the primary side has the accelerator pump. The accelerator pump is pretty easy. Just remember to put the spring in first. You'll know if you did it wrong when either the lever doesn't bounce back like this one, or when there's an extra spring on the workbench. The only thing I'll admit to is that this is the second take on installing the accelerator pump. The metering block doesn't have much to install. There is a specialty tool made just for installing jets, but a big bladed flathead screwdriver will work just fine. These especially do not need to be very tight. Wind them down and just give them a little extra at the end with your fingers. The power valve is up next. I prefer to hold the metering block in this position so I know the gasket will stay where it's supposed to on the shoulders of the power valve. It fits perfectly in a 12.1 inch wrench, but the paper gasket doesn't take much force to seal. We know it's not, but treat her like it's her first time. If you're using the right rebuild kit, just skip ahead about 12 seconds. If, like me, you're using leftovers from other kits or some parts store universal kit, it's probably best to do something like this about 18,000 times to make sure your gasket doesn't block off anything important looking. If the locating pins poke through, it's at least the right direction. There are several cork gaskets to choose from in the rebuild kits for the mixture idle screws. The thicker gaskets are what you want. Base tune for idle mixture screws is typically 1 1/2 turns out. That's 3 half turns. It might take a couple runs in to get the gasket seated, but be careful not to over tighten these mixture screws. This step is the same for all 4 corner idle adjustments as well. Next is the electric choke. If you have a mechanical choke and you can skip forward a few seconds, unless the only reason you don't have an electric choke is because you think they don't work as well as the cable. In that case, I'll just say it's user error. Electric chokes are crazy simple. A metal spring receives current, and as it heats up, it expands, and this causes it to move a small arm, which opens up the choke plate. When the choke flap is closed, it causes a richer mixture of fuel to enter the engine, which helps on cold mornings. How long it needs to heat up for controls when the flap opens, and this is your only adjustment for an electric choke. Electric chokes are typically wired to the ignition system, so the element inside starts heating up as soon as you apply ignition to the vehicle. The choke also receives a vacuum signal through a small port on the backside right here. This port gets a convenient peel and stick cork gasket before we can install it on the actual carburetor. One more check to make sure the spring is springy and that we assembled it properly, and then we can set it aside for later. The primary side of this 4160 carb is the only side that has a hole for the power valve to receive a vacuum signal right here. The double pumpers, or carbs with 2 accelerator pumps, frequently have a hole on the secondary side also. This side, without the hole, is where we install the metering plate. Pay close attention to the order these gaskets go on. It's easy to get them confused, and I also dug out the proper specialty tool to tighten these down so you guys didn't think I was just making it all up. When the secondary side bowl goes on, make sure the shorter bolts are used if there's no secondary metering block. It's probably best to install everything with the new plastic washers as well. I don't have a particular order for the assembly of most of these things, except I'll say it's easier to install the vacuum pod first and then the choke. Everything else is personal preference. With the vacuum pod on, we can get the choke installed. It's a bit tricky because of the way the little linkage arm needs to be installed, and I installed it backwards here first. You can see the fast idle cam assembly is below the choke rod and it needs to be above it. With it set up like this, the choke plate won't open all the way. The fast idle cam holds the choke open for warm starts. It's also the reason you have to pump the throttle once to set the choke. I always pump it 3 times to get a couple extra squirts from the accelerator pump in the barrels before cranking. Now that we have that fixed, we can put the cotter key in and move it up and down a bazillion times to make sure it works like it should. There isn't much to the throttle body for installation, just these 8 screws and the vacuum pod circlip. I will mention that I've stopped using rubber vacuum caps. They are an eventual source of a vacuum leak. The silicone caps are a bit more expensive, but like they say, buy once, cry once. There are a few things that need to be adjusted on this, but we'll get back to those in a little bit. Be very careful if you're planning to assemble this squirter nozzle on your engine. The butterflies are closed and will probably stop the small parts from falling inside, but they also might not. So just be careful. Lube is always a good idea. I had silicone on hand, but whatever you have laying around to lube up the O-rings for the fuel transfer tube are probably fine. The key is to prevent the rubbers from getting torn up during the complicated hand job ahead. For the primary metering block and bowl assemblies, one hand will hold the metering block while another hand holds the bowl assembly, and yet another hand will make sure the accelerator pump arm goes under the plunger, and 2 more hands will install the hardware. Don't forget to make the obligatory brap brap on the throttle linkage. You can make the noises. It's okay. I won't tell. A little trick I was introduced to was to rotate the bowl counterclockwise as a technique to keep the pump arm and plunger gap consistent. The gap is supposed to be 15 thousandths, or basically the thickness of a business card, and this trick kind of helps you keep that consistent every time you take the bowl on and off. The next step is arguably one of the most important for ensuring a good first start and generally a good running engine. We are going to use the idle adjustment screw here to put the butterflies on the correct part of the transfer slots. This is often called squaring off the transfer slots. First, we disengage the choke so we can be sure the throttle is stopping on the idle adjustment screw. Notice how the throttle stop is firmly against the idle screw and the transfer slot is closed. We want about 32 thousandths of the transfer slot shown, or for it to look square. The transfer slots help the engine transition smoothly from the tiny little idle feed hole to the comparatively vast openness of the throttle bore and booster circuit. That's pretty good right there. Now it's time to make some more of the noises. Come on, I'll do it with you. The last bit of setup we'll cover here is making sure that the rear blades are set up properly. Normally, on a vacuum secondary carb, you just want to make sure that they are all the way closed and resting on this stop screw and not rubbing against the walls of the bores. The throttle blades are harder than the carb body and it could wear them out. The only way to actuate the secondary throttle blades is with the primaries opened. The screwdriver underneath the fast idle adjustment screw does just the trick, while we make sure the secondary stop is adjusted properly. The only thing left to do with this carb is to install it on the Vega and dial it in. This carb is done, and thank you to all the commenters who said my first carb rebuild video sucked. That inspired me to spend weeks making this video, so I hope you enjoyed it.
Don't forget to subscribe if you like the content and want to see more